Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, so ready to hop in the time machine.
Yeah.
All right, we're going all the way back to post-World War II Greece and Turkey.
Oh, a period of, intense instability. And
Yeah.
the world's still kind of reeling from a global conflict.
Exactly. You've got a whole stack of sources there that I know you've been digging into that tell that story. We're talking Civil War, superpower rivalry, like the first tremors of the Cold War. So our mission today, how did what seemed like regional conflicts become a global powder keg?
Well, and, it's interesting. Both Greece and Turkey, they were grappling with their own internal divisions after World War II, right?
Yeah.
You had, anti-imperialist sentiments, passionate nationalism. This is also the rise of communism.
Yeah.
So you have all this internal chaos. And you know what that does? That becomes fertile ground for emerging superpowers. They're looking to expand their influence.
Right. It's like the whole world's trying to piece itself back together. And these two nations become like a focal point for this struggle between, democracy and communism.
Yeah, precisely. And this is where that concept of a proxy war really comes into play.
Oh, okay.
Where larger powers, they support different sides of a smaller conflict to,
To fight each other.
Exactly, yeah, indirectly.
Yeah.
So they can kind of keep their hands,
Clean.
well, a little bit, yeah.
Okay.
A little bit.
So Greece becomes a prime example of this with its civil war that raged from 1946 to 49. One side, the Greek government, had the backing of Western powers, Britain, the U.S.
Of course.
On the other side, you got the Greek Communist Party, potentially getting support from the Soviet Union.
Right.
Your sources really paint a picture of just how brutal this conflict was.
Yeah. And it's easy to forget, I think, that these ideological battles, they weren't just these abstract debates. They had real consequences, devastating consequences for the people, who were caught in the
hole in the ground. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, as if things weren't complicated enough already, Stalin sets his sights on the Dardanelles Strait.
Right.
That narrow channel connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Now, for those maybe who aren't geography buffs, this wasn't just about Stalin wanting a nice seaside feel.
No, definitely not.
Right.
Control of the Dardanelles, that would have given the Soviet Union a direct route into the Mediterranean, significantly increasing their naval power influence in the region.
It's a choke point.
It is, yeah, absolutely.
It's huge. Your sources mention that some historians believe Stalin saw this as a way to kind of exert pressure on Turkey, who at this point are still trying to, walk that tightrope, remain neutral in this growing East-West divide.
Right, a very precarious position to be in.
Yeah,
for sure.
And the West, particularly the United States, they're watching this.
Yeah.
They see this as a major power grab, right? Stalin's interest in the Dardanelles, it's a threat to the balance of power.
Oh, absolutely.
In the region, and a potential, stepping stone for further Soviet expansion.
Yeah, it's a classic case of, one step leads to another.
That's that, yeah.
Exactly.
So you've got two nations grappling with internal divisions. You've got a power vacuum in the wake of World War II.
Yeah.
And you've got these two superpowers kind of circling like hawks.
Yeah.
I mean, how could this not lead to a major showdown?
Right. It's almost like the stage was set for a confrontation.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened in 1947 with President Truman's address to Congress.
Okay.
This speech, we know it as the Truman Doctrine. It would have seismic repercussions for both Greece and Turkey, and really the world.
The Truman Doctrine, it really does have a dramatic ring to it, doesn't it?
It does.
Like something out of a history book.
Yeah.
But in 1947, this wasn't just about words. This was a defining moment, sent shockwaves, really, across the globe.
Yeah, absolutely. Truman's speech, it was a watershed moment. It essentially drew a line in the sand, right?
Yeah.
Declared that the United States would actively oppose the spread of communism wherever it appeared.
Wow.
Which, for the time, was a radical shift in American foreign policy.
So not just containing communism where it already existed, but actively pushing back against its spread.
Exactly.
That's a whole new ballgame.
Yeah.
But how did this doctrine actually play out, on the ground in Greece and Turkey?
Well, the Truman Doctrine, I mean, it wasn't just empty rhetoric, right? It translated into significant financial and military aid for both countries.
Okay.
So imagine you're like Greece in the late 1940s.
Yeah.
You're still recovering from Nazi occupation. Now you're in the middle of this civil war.
Brutal.
This aid, this was a lifeline, helped the Greek government fight back against the communist insurgency.
What about Turkey? They weren't facing a civil war, but they were definitely feeling the pressure from the Soviet Union.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. The aid to Turkey was more about, like, strengthening their defenses, you know?
Yeah.
Helping them resist those Soviet demands for control of the Dardanelles. In fact, one of your sources, I think it was, mentions this quote from a Turkish diplomat at the time, and he was expressing, like, relief, gratitude for the American support.
Yeah.
Really highlights just how precarious their position was. They were walking a tightrope.
So in the short term, it seems like the Truman Doctrine achieved its goal. Right.
It's that way.
The Greek government, with American backing, they're able to defeat the communist insurgency. Turkey's able to, stand firm against the Soviet pressure. But what about, like, the bigger picture?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, right? Because while the Truman Doctrine, it helped to stabilize Greece and Turkey in the short term, it also deepened the divide between the Soviet Union and the United States.
How so?
Well, the Soviets, they saw this as, like, American expansionism, like a blatant attempt to contain their influence and, shape the world in their image.
It's almost like this regional crisis became this, like, catalyst for this global ideological struggle that would define the Cold War.
Exactly. Yeah.
And your sources, they make it clear that historians still debate, like, the true motives, the true consequences of this whole period. It's not as clear cut as it might seem at first glance.
It rarely is with history, right?
Right.
History is rarely just black and white.
Yeah.
You have, for example, the Orthodox historians, right?
Yeah.
They tend to view the Soviet Union as the aggressor here.
Okay.
Greece and Turkey, to them, were early examples of Soviet attempts to expand their sphere of influence. And the Truman Doctrine was a necessary response to contain that expansion.
So from the Orthodox perspective, the U.S. was simply reacting to Soviet aggression.
Essentially, yeah. But then you have the revisionist historians.
Right.
And they offer a completely different perspective. They argue that the U.S. overreacted, that these events in Greece and Turkey were, like, primarily local conflicts, that the U.S. just blew out of proportion to justify their own intervention. They wanted to expand their own influence in the region.
Okay, so two very, very different takes on the same events.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that history is often about interpretation as much as it is about, just the facts.
100%, yeah.
But wait, there's more.
Jekyll's.
You've also got the realist perspective in the mix.
Right. The realists, they take a more, shall we say, pragmatic view.
Okay.
They focus less on ideology and more on the pursuit of power and strategic interests. They would argue that the Cold War, at its core, was about control of resources, about geopolitical advantage, the balance of power on a global scale.
So for the realists, like, that clash between democracy and communism was almost, like, secondary to these larger geopolitical forces that were at play.
In a way, yeah. They wouldn't deny that there was an ideological component to it.
Right.
But they would argue that it was often used as a justification for actions that were ultimately driven by much more practical concerns.
So we've got the Orthodox view, the revisionist view, and the realist view. Three very, very different lenses through which to view the same historical events. It makes you realize how complex and nuanced history can be.
Exactly. And to make things even more interesting, you have the post-revisionist historians who come in with, like, yet another layer of analysis.
Okay, so we've got these different schools of thought: Orthodox, revisionist, realist. Each one offering a different take on the motives and consequences of the Truman Doctrine. But then you mentioned the post-revisionists.
Right.
What do they bring to the table?
Well, the post-revisionists, they tend to take a more nuanced view, I'd say. They acknowledge the complexities of the Cold War. They recognize that there were missteps, miscalculations on both sides. They might argue, for instance, that while, the Soviet Union did exert pressure on Turkey, the U.S. might have, overestimated the threat a little bit.
Okay.
And reacted perhaps too aggressively. And in doing so, they actually escalated the situation.
It's like that classic example of, two people, they're staring at each other across a crowded room.
Yeah.
And they're both misinterpreting like the other one's body language. And it's just this like simple misunderstanding that turns into like a full-blown confrontation.
Exactly. Exactly. The post-revisionists, they remind us that history isn't just this like simple story of good guys and bad guys. It's about human beings often operating with, incomplete information, kind of stumbling in the dark a little bit. And the tragic consequences that can result from that, from miscommunication and mistrust.
So we've gone from, this regional instability in Greece and Turkey to like a global ideological struggle. It's fascinating how these events became like this early warning sign for what would become like the decades-long standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
It really is, and it just highlights how, seemingly isolated events can have these really far-reaching consequences. The Truman Doctrine, yeah, it was specifically aimed at Greece and Turkey in that moment, but it essentially set a precedent for U.S. involvement in containing communism all around the world.
Right.
It became a defining principle of American foreign policy for decades to come.
It's like that, that ripple effect, right? You throw a stone into a pond, and the waves just keep expanding outwards.
Yeah.
In this case, the stone was the Truman Doctrine. And the ripples, they were felt across the globe for decades.
Exactly, exactly. And those ripples, they're still being felt today. The way the U.S. views its role, like on the global stage, its relationship with Russia, even these ongoing tensions that we see in regions like the Middle East, you can trace a lot of it back to these pivotal years after World War II.
It makes you think about how interconnected history really is.
Yeah.
These events in Greece and Turkey, which might seem like, just this distant chapter in a history book.
Yeah.
They've had a real impact. Like they've shaped the world that we live in today.
Absolutely. And, it underscores the importance of understanding these historical events, not just from one perspective, but from multiple lenses. The Orthodox, the Revisionist, the Realist, the post-revisionist, each perspective offers a really valuable piece of the puzzle, I think, and it helps us to better grasp the complexities of the past and their impact on the present.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that history isn't just about, memorizing names and dates.
Right.
It's about understanding the forces that have shaped our world, the choices that people made, and oftentimes the unintended consequences that followed. And perhaps most importantly, it's about learning from the past.
Yeah.
So that we can make better decisions in the present.
Well said. Well said. And as you continue to kind of explore these sources and, dig deeper into this period, I want to leave you with this. How much of what we see, playing out on the global stage today is really influenced by the echoes of these early Cold War conflicts? It's a question worth pondering, I think, and it might offer some valuable insights into the world that we live in today, the challenges that we face here in the 21st century.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.